Hi, everybody. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to be presenting a paper today that I'm working on called The Effects of Return Migration on Job Search Methods, Evidence from Colombia. A little bit about this project. It's ongoing and the results are preliminary. So any suggestions or hints or tips that you have after the talk are very welcome. This is part of my dissertation on employment, migration, and networks. And I just wanted to give a thank you to Mariana Castro, who's been helping me out. A lot of the data that I accessed for this paper is protected at the Bogota government offices in Colombia, and I haven't been able to go since the pandemic started, so she is running some regressions for me. So the foundation of this study is that migrants integrate using their social networks. So we know, for example, that migrants use networks to find jobs when they arrive in a new destination, and that for both migrants and non-migrants, social capital and resources and information about jobs flow through ties, network ties. And so this can help people find jobs that are better matches for their skills and abilities, but also find work more quickly. So there are a lot of benefits to using networks to find a job. And for migrants in particular, there's a lot of work on how using their ties, both at origin and destination, can increase their well-being in terms of their employment. So for example, having social ties in the community of origin that can help you out when you arrive in destination can increase your chance of being employed. And this is likely through a mechanism of network contacts providing information about jobs, and they can help migrants find more desirable work, and that matches their skills a little bit better. So we know kind of a lot about the migrant experience using networks and to find jobs. We don't know a lot about return migrants. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk about return migrants as individuals that had a migration experience abroad and have since come back to their home country. And we don't know a lot about how they leverage or whether they leverage their networks to find jobs when they get home. So we do know a little bit about their migration experience and how this might help them in various ways. So migrants gain skills and employment when they travel abroad, and this can help them increase their occupational mobility upon return. They're also a little bit more likely to be entrepreneurs, and a lot of the literature on migrant entrepreneurship kind of underscores this the various skills that migrants pick up at their destination, and kind of takes a jack of all trades approach to understanding how migrants use their skills in various ways. And so this might lead us to believe that they can leverage their networks as well. So the question I'm asking is, are return migrants more likely to use friend, family, or acquaintance networks to find jobs than never migrants? So my hypotheses are underscored by a few facts that I brought up earlier that have emerged from the literature on this topic. So we know that migrants are more likely to use social networks at destination than non-migrants. And we also know that they have more skills and education that they can put these to use and leverage upon return. So with this in mind, I pose the hypothesis that return migrants are more likely to use social networks than non-return migrants to find a job when they get home and reintegrate. And so the context that I'm going to be studying this question in is Colombia. Colombia is a very unique case. So since the 1980s, there were massive waves of outmigration from Colombia to Venezuela. As violence and political and social strife was increasing in Colombia, Venezuela was seen as a safe haven and an attractive destination for Colombians. However, over the past decade, political, economic, and social strife and conflict have been increasing in Venezuela, and this has prompted a lot of Colombians to return home. Simultaneously in Colombia, the peace process has been ongoing and negotiations began in 2012. So simultaneous to conflict rising in Venezuela, things were getting a little bit more comfortable back home. And in particular, in August 2015 and 2015 in general, tensions were very high, and the Venezuelan government deported a large number of Colombians following a military kerfuffle. And this led to reports of tens of thousands of Colombians returning home because they feel unsafe and they feel politically persecuted. So I'm gonna use this, this deportation shock a little bit in my estimations later, but just to show it a little bit more clearly, there are kind of a steady stream. These are deportations of Colombians in Venezuela returning back to Colombia. So we see a steady stream of deportations over the years, but we do see these spikes in 2015 following this conflict between the Venezuelan government and Colombian migrants. And simultaneously, the Venezuelan government was blaming Colombian migrants for a variety of issues in the country. And so people were inclined to leave. So the data that I'm going to be using to test my hypothesis is the Great Integrated Household Survey, which is a representative household survey from Colombia. I'm using 2016, 2017, and 2018, and I have a couple more years that I would like to add in the future. So each year has about 750,000 observations, and they're collected each month. And of these 3 years, 14,000 individuals in the sample were return migrants from Venezuela. So it's a pretty rare event, but I do get a sufficient sample size to estimate to run some tests. The outcome variable that I'm looking at is whether the individual used friends, family, and acquaintance networks to help them find their most recent job. And the independent variable is whether the individual is a return migrant. So just to give a basic overview of some of the descriptives, we see that return migrants are a little bit younger. They're a little bit more likely to be male. They are slightly less educated. We see they have larger numbers of secondary education and fewer with more than university, for example, than non-return migrants. And just in terms of descriptives, there do seem to be correlation between using friends and family to find a job and being a return migrant. They're a bit less likely to have a permanent job upon return, and their salary is a little bit lower. So to test my hypothesis, I'm going to run a series of Ols regressions. So my outcome variable is just the job search strategy. It's actually a 0-1 variable, whether or not that individual used friends and family to find their most recent job. And trying to estimate beta 1. So the X variable indicates whether or not the individual is a return migrant. And I control for individual characteristics, household characteristics, some geographic and some time fixed effects as well. So studies in return migration are plagued with endogeneity issues. For example, when migrants are deciding the timing of their return, that might be correlated with, for example, looking for a job or finding a job. And so there might be some interplay or correlation between timing of departure and job search method. So I try to get around this by constructing 3 different independent variables that I'll explain here. So the first is this endogenous variable that takes a 1 if the individual is a return migrant from Venezuela and 0 otherwise. The second variable, I restrict the return migrants to individuals that indicated an exogenous reason for leaving. So either they were deported, they left in the wake of a natural disaster, or they felt threatened or persecuted. And that's kind of how I treat that kind of exogenous shock. The last is a timing variable. So I try to estimate based on some other survey questions exactly when they return back to Colombia. And they return migrants get a 1 if the individual is estimated to both be a return migrant and have left in 2015, that year, following many deportation shocks. So I end up with the sample size, 3 different independent variables. The first is around 4,000, and then the 2 other shocks are a little bit rarer. So it is a relatively rare event. So here are some preliminary regression results. Pretty much across the board, there's a positive correlation between being a return migrant and using friends, family, and acquaintance networks in your job search. So in terms of the controls here, the controls are successive, or they sum. So basically, this one includes all of the controls from these other ones listed below. So the most restrictive model in this case is model 4. And so I control for some geographic and time variables, some individual characteristics of the migrants, household characteristics, and work contracts. And we still find an increase of about 10% likelihood of using friends and family networks upon return, compared to never migrants, I should say. So all in all, there seems to be this strong positive relationship between return migration and the use of friends and family. And so the interpretation that I currently have is the idea that migrants go abroad and learn and practice using their networks and this job search strategy that is typically successful for migrants abroad. And then when they return home, they leverage those same practices to find a job. And contrary to some other literature in this topic, migrants seem to not lose their ties when they migrate, and they still have access to local networks upon their return. And I think particularly the fact that when I control for household size, the effect doesn't go away. This is not necessarily people just leveraging their parents and siblings, for example. They seem to have larger local networks that they are using to find jobs. And my kind of policy point here is that to support integration of migrants upon their return, it's necessary both to include social integration and ensure that migrants are connected to other locals alongside active labor market programs, because both of these things can support migrants in their job search and integration. So the next steps are really just to strengthen these estimations, like to control for a few more job and industry characteristics. I have a very long list of industries that the jobs belong to, and I need to parse it out into categories. And I like to combine some of the independent variables and see if I can do so without losing too much sample. So combine both the timing of return and the exogenous reason. And then lastly, the kind of step 2 of this project is to examine whether migrants actually do experience occupational mobility when they use their networks, and or better job matches. So whether these are actually successful outcomes. And that's it. Thank you so much.